Hello, everyone, and welcome back to We're All Mad Here, episode 155. I'm your host, Rachel. I've never been a fan of classic Hollywood, so I don't know much about any of its stars. So if you're like me, this week's episode on Judy Garland is going to be a wild ride. If you already know Judy Garland's story, you'll still enjoy it. Judy Garland was a stage name. Judy was born Frances Ethel Gumm on June 10th, 1922, in Grand Rapids, Minnesota. She was named after both of her parents, Frank and Ethel, and was the baby of 3 sisters. Because she and her dad shared a first name, Frances was usually called Baby Frances, or simply Baby. Sister Mary Jane was 8 years older than Frances, and Virginia was 6 years older. Frank and Ethel were vaudevillians, and they ran a movie theater in Grand Rapids that also featured regular vaudeville acts. Before Judy was born, Mary Jane and Virginia were already performing with their parents on stage, so it didn't take long for Judy to get involved too. Her first public show was when she was 2 years old, singing Jingle Bells with her family. The Gumm family's life was brought to a screeching halt in 1926 when Frank was allegedly caught mid-romantic encounter with another man, and the news spread quickly around Grand Rapids. The Gumms quickly relocated to Lancaster, California, where they bought another theater and tried to resume their lives. I don't know if the Gumms chose Lancaster for its close proximity to Los Angeles, but Ethel took advantage of the distance to showcase her 3 talented daughters and get them some professional training. In 1928, the sisters enrolled in a dance school, which contained the Meglin Kiddies dance troupe. All 3 Gumm children joined the troupe and appeared in a 1929 short film with the group called The Big Review. In the film, the sisters had their own song and dance number. They did several more short film appearances, and in one for Vitaphone, A Holiday in Storyland, 7-year-old baby Frances had her first on-screen solo. While Mary Jane and Virginia were talented, it was Frances who stood out due to her mature beyond her years singing voice. Nicknamed the little girl with the leather lungs, it was her voice that landed the Gumm sisters many of their gigs. Starting in the early 1930s, the Gumm girls jumped into the vaudeville circuit. They were informed several times by producers and artistic directors that Gumm was a terrible surname. Once they were incorrectly billed as the Glum sisters. Finally, after an audience at the Oriental Theater laughed at their last name, George Jessel, the director of the theater, put his foot down. He claims that he gave them the last name Garland after Carole Lombard's character Lily Garland in a film that was playing at the theater. Frances's daughter, Lorna, said decades later that it was inspired when Jessel said that the Gumm sisters were prettier than a garland of flowers. However the name came about, Mary Jane and Virginia didn't have much of a chance to use it. After the trio's last short film appearance, the group broke up and Mary Jane didn't perform much after that. She was 20 by then and ran off to Reno to get married to a musician. Virginia, 18 at the time, would perform here and there in some of her younger sister's films, but of course neither of them became famous like baby Frances. Frances's first name was changed officially with her last in 1934, and she was inspired to choose Judy after a Hoagie Carmichael song. After hearing about the Gumm sisters, Louis B. Mayer of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, known now as MGM, sent an associate to go see the trio perform at the Orpheum Theater. A few days later, the newly christened Judy and her father were invited to the MGM studio in Culver City for an impromptu audition. Though she was only 13, Judy had 11 years of performing under her belt and had no problem singing 2 songs on command. Apparently, she'd done a few screen tests at MGM a few months before, so the test that would normally have followed a successful audition was skipped. MGM seemed to be in a hurry to get her career started, which makes little sense because once they had signed her, they had no idea what to do with her. Back then, Hollywood studio contracts were exclusive. If you were signed with MGM, you only worked for MGM. And if you were a fresh-off-the-bus actress, you were also expected to take performing classes at that studio's school. Judy was in a class with fellow 13-year-olds Lana Turner and Ava Gardner. While her classmates truly looked like young women and were promoted as such, Judy was considered the ugly duckling of the group. She had already reached her final height of 4'11", and while she was not plus-sized at all, she weighed perhaps 100 pounds at 13, her height, round face, and the fact that she had even the hint of a bosom placed her in the plus-size category in old Hollywood. But this just confused MGM even more about her place in films. Judy may have had more curves than Turner and Gardner, but those two were the ones MGM planned to push as young adult love interests. So Judy was constantly placed into little girl roles. That being said, she was still too old for true child star roles. Between this confusion and studio head Louis B. Mayer nicknaming her his little hunchback, Judy developed a permanent complex about her looks and weight. Her confidence fell even further when her father died the same year she entered Hollywood. Frank Gum died from meningitis at only 49, and Judy, always a daddy's girl, didn't have much of a connection with her mother after that, eventually becoming estranged from her altogether. Despite not being considered the glamorous type, we all know today that Judy had an incredibly successful career. But she would have to wait nearly a decade to gain any kind of confidence. From 1935 to 1942, she appeared in 16 films, and in every single one of them, she was forced to wear removable caps on her teeth and rubber discs that reshaped her nose. The Wizard of Oz was filmed in the middle of this ordeal. In 1936, Judy was finally noticed for real after being hired to sing at Clark Gable's birthday party. While her glamorous classmates could carry a tune, their singing didn't hold a candle to Judy's. After her birthday party gig, Judy was paired with Mickey Rooney in a few backyard musicals, a B-movie in 1937, and finally, in the fourth Hardy family movie, Love Finds Andy Hardy, introducing Judy to mainstream movie audiences. In true MGM fashion, Judy was cast as Andy's adorable, literal girl next door, and Lana Turner played the love interest. In addition to Judy's false teeth and nose discs, MGM was also obsessed with her weight. The studio kept her on a diet at all times. If she went to craft services and asked for the dish of the day, she would be served soup and lettuce. She was encouraged to exercise daily and to avoid food as much as possible. The amphetamines given to Judy during filming helped stave off her appetite too, though the real reason she, and allegedly the other young actors, were given these was to allow them to work 12+ hours a day as MGM cranked out film after film. Decades later, Andy Rooney would say that neither amphetamines nor barbiturates were given to the actors, and that Judy's reliance on them during her life was her own choice. When Judy was 16, she was cast as Dorothy Gale in The Wizard of Oz. She was not the first choice for the role. In fact, she was the third. Mayer wanted Shirley Temple, the only classic Hollywood star I've ever been obsessed over, but she was signed with a different studio. Actress Deanne Durbin was then asked but wasn't available, and so the producers got Judy, whom they'd wanted all along anyway. MGM set about making Judy feel as bad as possible about herself. In addition to the tooth caps and nose discs, she was put in a blonde wig, and the gingham pattern of her pinafore was chosen for its blurring effect, which would hide her curves. Some of the film was shot with the blonde wig, but eventually it was decided to use Judy's own brown hair. Hollywood studios back in the day were true machines, producing film after film, sometimes shooting one in just a few weeks. This meant that at the same time Judy was doing press tours promoting Oz, she was doing the same for Babes in Arms. There were rumors that Judy had been put on a strict diet of cigarettes, chicken soup, and coffee. Later, historians Jay Scarfoni and William Stillman declared that this couldn't be true, as Judy was a non-smoker at the time, and that, quote, she was allowed to eat food, just not as much as a growing teen girl would prefer to eat, which I don't think is a lot better. As usual, Judy was also encouraged to exercise as much as possible, in her copious downtime. For The Wizard of Oz, Judy received her only Academy Award at the 1939 Oscars ceremony. She was given an Academy Juvenile Award, only one of 12 people to receive one. 1940 was a tumultuous year for Judy. Professionally, she was kind of killing it. She had 3 films out at once. But personally, she had her first real heartbreak. She was dating Artie Shaw and was deeply in love with him. But just as had happened in a few of her movies, Shaw ran off with her old MGM classmate, Lana Turner. Even though one of her films that year involved her playing her very first adult character, in real life, Turner was still being chosen over her to act out grown-up scenes. It seems like Judy kind of dodged a bullet, though. Turner was just one of Shaw's 8 wives and was allegedly very emotionally abusive. Also, when Shaw and Turner eloped, Shaw was engaged to Betty Grable. And this guy played the fucking clarinet. In a classic rebound situation, Judy quickly got together with musician David Rose. On her 18th birthday, Rose proposed to her. There were 2 problems, though. 1, movie stars had to get approval from their studios regarding all big life events, and 2, Rose was married. He was in the process of getting divorced, but MGM turned Rose down for Judy. The couple persevered, though, and MGM agreed to let them get married after Rose's divorce was final. Judy and Rose were married on July 27, 1941. Judy soon became pregnant, but again, the studio had to approve, and they didn't. Neither did Judy's mother, and she was forced to get an abortion. In 1943, MGM made another bid at trying to let Judy grow up on screen. Her hair was lightened, and she wore glamorous makeup and gowns for her role in presenting Lily Mars. Despite all that, Judy felt like an imposter, and moviegoers hated seeing her like that. They wanted Judy to be who they'd always known her as, the cute little prodigy. In addition to this rejection from the public, Judy was also going through even more personal tragedies. She'd gotten pregnant by Tyrone Power and was forced to abort that pregnancy too. Audiences may have wanted her to play children forever, but Judy's personal life, even though she was only 21, was firmly in adulthood. To make sure Judy was fully aware of this, the universe dealt her a trial separation from Rose in January of 1943, which culminated in divorce in 1944. Around this time, Judy was cast in Meet Me in St. Louis. This film impacted Judy's life in two huge ways. First, the director was Vincente Minnelli, whom she would later marry and have a daughter with. But second, and perhaps more importantly, she met Dorothy Ponadell. Dorothy was a makeup artist, and during the trials for Judy's makeup for Meet Me in St. Louis, Dorothy announced that she wasn't going to force Judy to wear either the tooth caps or nose-shaping discs that she'd been wearing for almost a decade. "You're a pretty girl," Dorothy told Judy. And despite probably being told this thousands of times in her life, Judy finally believed someone. From that film on, Dorothy was in Judy's contract as a requirement on her movie sets. To be honest, Judy's relationship with Dorothy was probably the most stable one of her entire life. During the filming of Meet Me in St. Louis, Judy had a fling with Orson Welles, because why not? The same year the fling ended, Judy and Vincente Minnelli were married. Judy again became pregnant and was finally allowed to keep it. Their daughter Liza was born on March 12, 1946. In 1945, Judy's film The Clock was released. It was Judy's first ever straight drama role. Viewers of the film expressed that, yeah, Judy had been good in the movie, but why didn't she sing? Judy was still stuck in her creative rut. In April of 1948, while filming The Pirate, Judy would have a nervous breakdown. She was sent to a private sanatorium for a while, but like the well-trained performer MGM had raised, she left the facility, finished the film, and soon after tried to kill herself. After that, she went to the Austin Riggs Center in Massachusetts for treatment. Unfortunately, she was only treated for her depression at Austin Riggs, so once she left and was back on film sets, she got right back onto the drugs that MGM allegedly gave her like candy. In addition to prescription sleeping pills and possibly amphetamines, she had also illegally gotten a hold of morphine pills. And in addition to that, she started drinking heavily and suffered from migraines. A doctor Judy saw at this time told MGM that if they were going to cast her in more films, Judy could only work for 4 or 5 days in a row and then would need weeks of rest in between. Considering the absolute factory MGM was, this wouldn't work for them, and so neither would Judy. Her contract was suspended on July 18, 1946, and she lost her newest role opposite Fred Astaire. A few months after being suspended from MGM, Judy returned to work and redeemed herself with the very successful In the Good Old Summertime. A few years passed quietly, but then came Annie Get Your Gun. Judy was playing the titular character in the remake and was extremely nervous. Ethel Merman had originated the role, and despite being a legend herself, Judy didn't feel that she could fill Merman's shoes. Annie is also a very unglamorous role. She's an outspoken tomboy, and despite being a romantic role as well, Judy was worried that Annie's messy hair and unfeminine outfits would allow audiences to crave her in adolescent roles again. She also didn't get along with the director, Busby Berkeley. But Berkeley may have been in the right. He said that Judy wasn't putting any effort into her role, and in what would become a pattern for the rest of Judy's film career, Judy often arrived late to work or sometimes didn't show up at all. This isn't just annoying and a waste of time. It also costs a lot of money to delay filming when your leading lady is missing. Eventually, Judy was replaced in the film by Betty Hutton, and it was probably just as well. All through the time she was shooting Annie Get Your Gun, she was also undergoing electroshock therapy and probably needed to just deal with that. And she did, with a long stay at Peter Bent Brigham Hospital in Boston. There, she was not only treated for her mental illnesses, but her forms of self-medication. Not only was she rehabbed from the drugs and able to sleep on her own, but she was allowed to eat normally too. After her death, colleagues would say that Judy had most likely been bulimic for most of her life. Hardly surprising since she didn't have time to exercise off the weight MGM imagined she had. While at the hospital, Judy spent time with the disabled children in the pediatric ward. She really enjoyed doing this. Quote, "It helped me by just getting my mind off of myself. They were so delightful, they were so loving and good, I forgot myself for a change." Judy's own daughter was only about 4 years old at the time. Once Judy left the hospital, healthier physically and mentally, MGM immediately undid all her hard work. She was far too fat, they told her, and gave her some amphetamine so she could lose 15 pounds in order to star in Summer Stock. Again, Judy started to be late or absent to set, behavior that eventually got her fired from the film she did after Summer Stock, Royal Wedding. Never considering that they might be part of the problem, MGM suspended Judy for her behavior in June of 1950. She was replaced in a film and soon after attempted suicide again. Quote, "All I could see ahead was more confusion. I wanted to black out the future as well as the past. I wanted to hurt myself and everyone who hurt me." Obviously, she survived her attempt, and as a congratulations, MGM released her from her contract for good. Unfortunately, while Judy didn't need MGM to have a career, the damage the studio had inflicted on her body and mind was done. Later, Judy would state that MGM had stolen her childhood, and as we all know, the addictions they encouraged would follow her for the rest of her life. Judy didn't do a ton of movie acting after she left MGM, but I think that's for the best. Comparing how she approached performing in a movie versus performing live on stage, I started thinking while doing research that aside from her physical and mental obstacles, maybe Judy just didn't like being on a film set. After leaving MGM, her career would be mostly live appearances and concerts. From what I read, she rarely missed a concert performance and made sure to appear even when she wasn't feeling great. She did not do the same for films. I wonder how different her relationship with her career would be if she'd done theater or vaudeville instead. Or maybe she just hated acting altogether. Whatever her reasons, Judy did appear in 2 of her most acclaimed roles soon after leaving MGM. She appeared in the 1954 remake of A Star is Born, which got her a nomination for the Best Actress Oscar, and in 1961's Judgment at Nuremberg, for which she got a Best Supporting Actress nomination. Judy was great friends with Bing Crosby, and Crosby had possibly the biggest hand in saving Judy's career. At this point, she was too depressed to save it herself. Crosby had a radio show which was taped with a live studio audience, and Crosby invited Judy to perform on it. Aside from getting a popular and talented performer on his show, Crosby also knew that Judy was running out of money. Any audience would have been thrilled to see Judy Garland perform live. They didn't know about the studio drama. They probably would have lined up to listen to her read the phone book. But just before she went in front of the crowd on Crosby's show, Judy got cold feet. She was worried that they would be looking for the scars left by her suicide attempt and judge her. Crosby said he would take care of it and went out to talk to the audience. "We got a friend here," he told them. "She's had a little trouble recently. You probably heard about it. Everything is fine now. She needs our love and she needs our support. Let's give it to her, okay?" According to reporter Hal Cancer, she came out and the place went crazy. She just blossomed. After this successful first appearance, Judy performed on the show 8 times that season, and Garland fever was abound again. She didn't need MGM anymore, and as I mentioned, she just seemed to enjoy concerts way more than acting or being on a film set. She did a 4-month European concert tour in 1951, and every show was sold out. After that, she did another 4-month tour, this time international. Her appearance at the Palace Theater in New York City was so successful, it exceeded all records at the theater and has been called one of the greatest personal triumphs in show business history. After performing at the Palladium in London, Judy said, "I suddenly knew that this was the beginning of a new life. Hollywood thought I was through. Then came the appearance at the Palladium, where I can truthfully say Judy Garland was reborn." Harkening back to her roots, Judy included some nods to vaudeville in her concert and was given a special Tony Award for reviving the art form. The year Judy Garland felt reborn, she also divorced Minnelli and quite soon after married her tour manager Sidney Luft on June 8, 1952. She loves those summer weddings. Just 6 months later, daughter Lorna would be born. Oops. Judy and Luft created a production company and worked with Warner Brothers on 3 films, one of which was the 1954 remake of A Star is Born. And the second she was back on a film set, Judy's bad habits of being late or missing completely from work began again. This time, though, she wasn't fired, and after seeing the film, Time called her performance in A Star is Born just about the greatest one-woman show in modern movie history. She was finally nominated for Best Actress, but couldn't attend the ceremony because she was literally giving birth to her son Joey. Still, news crews crowded into her hospital room to film her reaction when she won. Except she didn't win. As soon as the crews learned that Grace Kelly had gotten the golden statue, they all packed up their gear and were out of Judy's room before Kelly's acceptance speech was over. Many in Hollywood believe Judy was robbed of the Oscar, but she did win a Golden Globe for her performance. Beginning in 1955, Judy filmed a lot of television specials, which were very popular and she loved to do. In 1956, she did a 4-week run in Las Vegas, for which she was paid $55,000 a week. This makes her the highest paid performer to work in Las Vegas. While Judy's career was blossoming, her body could not keep up. Between her mental illnesses, her drug and alcohol abuse, and her eating disorders, Judy was not doing well physically. In November of 1959, she was in the hospital for weeks with acute hepatitis. When she was released, the doctors advised her that she had 5 years or less to live, and even if she lived longer, she'd never perform again. Judy wasn't upset at this. Quote, "The pressure was off me for the first time in my life." As it happened, the doctors were wrong on both counts. Judy would not only live twice as long as they had predicted, but she never stopped performing. After recovering from her hospital stay for a few months, Judy hit the road, performing again at the Palladium in London and making plans to move to the city permanently. She'd always said she'd never do a daytime TV show, but in what was called the biggest talent deal in TV history, CBS offered Judy $24 million to do The Judy Garland Show. Despite Judy's popularity, the show didn't do well and only ran for a year, from 1963 to 64. During this year, though, true to her fashion, Judy managed to have a passionate fling with actor Glenn Ford. Even though it was only 6 months long, biographers have labeled it one of Judy's most stable relationships, though Dorothy the makeup artist still has my vote. Most think that Judy took the deal with CBS because, like she was most of her life despite her success, she was broke. She owed several $100,000 to the IRS. Many of her films, even when they were successful, didn't net her any box office money because her truancy had cost the production company so much money. She also had a lot of bills to pay to her divorce lawyer. She had filed for divorce from Luft several times over the last 8 years, but they were finally going through with it. In November of 1964, Judy once again performed a concert series at the Palladium, this time joined by now 18-year-old daughter Liza. Judy then went to Australia, where she had 2 successful performances in Sydney. When she got to Melbourne, though, she was an hour late to her own show. While the audience waited for her, a rumor spread that Judy was late because she was drunk. When she finally came out on stage, the crowd of 7,000 booed her, possibly her worst fear. She tried to do the show for 45 minutes, but finally ran off stage. While her divorce from Luft was still pending, Judy married tour promoter Mark Herron, with their legal marriage date being November 14, 1965. They separated 5 months later, but wouldn't divorce until February of 1969. While that divorce was going on, Judy's health was once again on a decline. She was back in London doing a 5-week concert, making a quick trip to Copenhagen in March, which would be her last concert appearance ever. Judy knew that she didn't have much longer, but she squeezed in one last marriage, this time to British nightclub manager Mickey Deans. 4 months later, on June 22, 1969, Judy was found dead in the bathroom of her rented home in Belgravia, which is a very fancy part of London. According to the coroner, her death was caused by an accidental overdose of barbiturates. Whatever the tabloids might shout, and Judy's own history might imply, there was no evidence of suicide. Her body showed that she'd taken the drugs over a long period of time, rather than all at once, and she'd left behind quite a lot of drugs that would have been helpful if she wanted to kill herself. Not to mention her already ill health and damage from prior substance abuse and eating disorders. Judy was only 47, but as Wizard of Oz co-star Ray Bolgner commented at her funeral, she just plain wore out. When final husband Mickey Deans brought Judy's remains back to New York City, about 20,000 people were waiting to pay their respects at the Frank E. Campbell Funeral Chapel. Despite her long and illustrious career, at the time of her death, Judy's estate only came to about $40,000, about $220 in today's money. Daughter Liza worked to pay off her mother's debts, and friend Frank Sinatra donated money toward the cause. Since Judy's death, over 30 biographies have been written about her, including one by her younger daughter Lorna, who also became a performer. While the biographies of course include how talented she was, some also show sides of Judy that perhaps the public wouldn't want to see. If they couldn't handle Judy playing the part of an adult on screen, they probably also didn't want to hear from Stevie Phillips, one of Judy's agents, that Judy was a demented, demanding, supremely talented drug addict. Writer Tony Farrell described her as, quote, a grab bag of contradictions, tender and endearing, yet savage and turbulent, a creature of extremes, greedy, sensual, and demanding, gluttonous for pleasure and pain. In 2017, Judy's remains were moved from a cemetery outside of Manhattan to the Hollywood Forever Cemetery. Daughter Lorna's greatest hope for her mother's legacy is that she's not regarded as a tragic figure. Quote, we all have tragedies in our lives, but that does not make us tragic. She was funny, and she was warm, and she was wonderfully gifted. We lost her at 47 years old. That was tragic. But she was not a tragic figure. Thanks for checking out this week's episode of We're All Mad Here. If you like what I'm doing, you can leave a 5-star review on iTunes. It really helps people find the show. And if you really like what I'm doing, you can go to patreon.com/allmadpodcast for early episodes and bonus episodes. And of course, you can find me on social media, Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, and you can email me at allmadpod@gmail.com. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.